Welcome to Cross Party Lines with Chris Finlayson, Phil Goff, and myself, Sam Collins. It's a podcast designed to unpack New Zealand politics so that you don't have to. And I just want to say a big thank you for all the support that you, the listener, has shown this project so far. We've obviously done our first month, and in that first month, we had over 17,000 plays across Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. And that was by about 6 or 7,000 people. So people are definitely coming back for more. The other stat that I can tell you as a listener, though, is that only 1,400 people have actually hit follow on the show on Apple or Spotify. So if you're listening and you haven't hit follow, please hit that follow button now because it really helps us grow within the algorithm. So do that. We'll wait a second. Okay, thank you for hitting follow. Right, so Phil and I have been at the Labour Party conference all weekend, but Chris, you managed to jump over the ditch for a show. Did you do that on purpose so you didn't have to see so much of the old happy clappy Labour Party on the news?
No, I just went over for Beethoven's Ninth with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. It was pure indulgence, and then had my usual troubles coming home. I can't blame Air New Zealand because I was flying Qantas, but the Air New Zealand flights were all delayed anyway. At the end of the runway in Sydney, there's an A320 of Air New Zealand that's been there for a couple of days. I think Air New Zealand's really hitting almost the tipping point. Everyone loves Air New Zealand. And Phil, do you recall that sense of pride when you got to Heathrow to fly home and you saw the koru and you really felt good about it?
Yeah, you were on New Zealand soil before you left the UK. It was good.
Correct. And it felt really good. But I really feel that they're losing it fast. They're losing the loyalty of New Zealanders. And this sort of rebranding of the Koru clubs, just all nonsense. People don't really care about that. They just want a plane that flies. But some disastrous decisions have been made in recent years, getting rid of the Beach 1900s, the number of cancellations because of problems with the Q300s and the planes they bought where the engines don't work. So my impression is that Air New Zealand's got to be very careful, because when you start losing the support of people like me, who have traditionally been so proud of Air New Zealand, and I've switched to Qantas whenever I can internationally, then I think they've got a serious problem.
And you were saying the other day that you wouldn't mind seeing maybe Qantas or someone come back in and sort of provide some competition with the regional routes as well.
Yeah, well, let's go back to ancient history. And Phil, you were in Cabinet when Prebble took that proposition to Cabinet, and he said, well, Air New Zealand's so shocking that we really need to provide some competition. So he went and saw Reggie Ansett, and Ansett set up in New Zealand. And all of a sudden, standards improved. I bet you if Qantas entered into the market and started to provide a full service, including to provincial routes, then it would be all on. I regret to say that I think it's necessary.
Wow. If anyone from Qantas is listening, I'm sure Chris would love a spot as the chair of the New Zealand the New Zealand operation. Anyway,
And we thank you for your patience. That's the great clarion cry of in New Zealand these days. We thank you for your patience.
so for those that have run out of patience for the topics, this is what we're going to be talking about today: regional council reform, the UK budget, which was released last week, and then also we'll finish up with a bit of a roundup of the Labour Party conference, which happened in Auckland over the weekend. But we will start with that local government news. Last week, National announced a shake-up of the regional councils around the country. Essentially, they've said that they will be abolished at the end of this term, which is in 2028, and replaced initially by a group made up of the mayors from within the regional catchments called Combined Territory Boards. And they would then have 2 years to plan what they would do in the future. And they have also just announced today, actually, we're recording at about 6 o'clock on Monday, the 1st of December, that they will also look at the council rates and cap them at between 2 and 4% from 2029 as well. So there's lots coming down the line. But Chris, why do we need to be looking at reform for these entities and specifically like the regional councils? Do you think there's this is policy?
Oh, I think local government's one of those areas that's critically important to the country's future, and the relationship between central government and local government needs thorough study and very careful analysis, because clearly local government's struggling. And I think it's time to go back to basics. What's the role of local government? Are some of the traditional roles that they've held no longer viable? Should they be held by others? And then that leads into a reform of the Local Government Act 2002, which clearly is not fit for purpose anymore. There's no criticism, it's just done its time. And then you move into structures. For myself, I think some kind of reform is obviously necessary. For example, in Wellington, in Greater Wellington, I hope Fran Wild, now that she's chair or mayor of the South Wairarapa District Council, will help create a unitary Wairarapa Council out of 3 mini councils. I think there's a good case for merger of Upper Hutt and Lower Hutt, and probably Wellington and Porirua, where a regional council would fit into that is a really interesting question. So there are all these questions. Of course, in Auckland, the big bang occurred when Rodney Hyde was the minister, and of course I defer on much of the stuff to my colleague who served his city as mayor for 6 years. So I do think reform is necessary. Whether bits and pieces reform is the way to go about it, or whether you've got to say, look, it's such a fundamental question, we've got to go back to basics and step through the various areas of reform in a fairly coherent way, rewrite the Local Government Act, and make sure it's fit for purpose for the next 20 years. That's what I'd do.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm all in favour of reform, but it's got to be the right sort of reform, and it's got to be done in the right way. Never believe that you can't make matters worse by ill thought out policy implemented badly. And this is what I really fear about what I've seen so far. Look, going back to Chris's comments about Auckland, the reform in Auckland, where you had 7 territorial authorities, which is, each local council, Manukau Local Council, Waitakere, I think it was called in those days, Auckland City, etc., and an Auckland Regional Council were replaced by one body. Now, that followed the Royal Commission on Auckland, where it said that the old system was fragmented, uncoordinated, and not serving its purpose. And frankly, I think a unitary authority where you combine the territorial authorities in one natural region, which is the region of Auckland, and you combine that with the Auckland Regional Council made sense. I mean, there's some bloody stupid things happening before that occurred. I mean, you had the territorial mayors and the territorial authorities suing the chair of the Auckland Regional Council. It was a bun fight, no agreement. And you don't need that. And you don't need duplication. And you certainly don't want fragmentation. And when you're planning for a city, which is, 1.7 million Aucklanders, you want to plan across the whole city, not a whole lot of separate plans that might not work in with each other. So, look, it hasn't been perfect, but it's been an improvement. Now, what worries me about the new model is what they're planning to replace it with. And they said they're not going to do away with the regional councils. This seems to be the impression that's given. The regional councils will go. No, the bureaucracies will stay, which do the spending, all the spending of the money, but you'll replace the democratic side of regional councils, which is their elected representatives. Now, I saw a great example of Christchurch. They said there's 2 things we can do. We can combine all the authorities and give them 1 vote each. Now, in Christchurch, that means that there'll be, say, 6 rural authorities, which will be able to outvote Christchurch City by 6 to 1, even though Christchurch City is about 60 or 70% of the population. Or you do it on a population basis, in which case Christchurch City would be able to outvote all of the rural areas every time. Now, neither of those options seem very sensible to me in governance. But look, by all means, work it through. But it doesn't seem to me that the work has been done ahead of making that announcement. There'll be a consultation process to February. But I think, local government, central government should be partnership. But if you want me to get really steamed up, tell me about the rates cap. So there's a 2 to 4% cap on rates. Now, Auckland City, when I was mayor, was growing by 40,000 a year, and the demand for infrastructure was huge. So we'd be capped at the same rate as a Potiki, say, that may not be growing at all. Well, that's just bloody nonsense. This is pure politics. Here's a government that hasn't been able to get in control of the cost of living. Now, rates have gone up quite steeply, but there's a reason for it. So they said, we'll create the illusion that we're going to do something about cost of living by stopping the local governments from rating to build the infrastructure that they need. And by the way, as well as stopping them rate, we won't give them a bed tax so that they can properly market for tourism purposes. We won't return the 15% that we put on rates in GST, which should properly be devolved back to the councils. And by the way, we won't pay Auckland City the $38 million that we claim in rates exemption for every government property in the city. So you've got a government that says to the local government, stop spending, but by the way, we're not going to give you alternative methods. And by the way, you've neglected infrastructure for years and you should be spending more on it. Well, it just doesn't make sense. And I think it's crap. I think it's about an appeal to the electorate. Local governments have got to be sensible in their spending, but don't give them more and more responsibilities, which central government's been doing for decades, and then say you can spend less and less on the more and more responsibilities that we've given you. Don't worry about nice to haves, they said. They would love it if we'd built Stalinistic structures in each railway station in Auckland for the City Rail Link instead of the beautiful stations that we've actually created. But those stations are going to be there 150 years. Let's build infrastructure that we're proud of, not crap because we have to do things on the cheap. There endeth the sermon.
Now we've got Phil all wound up on the rates cap. Chris, did you have a view on the rates cap at all? Do you think, I mean, obviously this was pretty well signalled. Like what you can say about the regional council reform is that maybe that sort of just popped up, even though we know they've been looking at local government for a little bit. But what we know they've been looking at and what they've been talking about for a while was a rates cap. Do you think that this is the way to control the cost of living?
Well, look, I hear what Phil said. I think of Wellington. What did you say? $38 million for Auckland that the Crown claims an exemption for.
Yeah.
Well, think about what Andrew's got to put up with in Wellington. It'd be worse, and it'd be hundreds of millions of dollars. Maybe that is a way in which
free, those bloody central government politicians.
That's right. That's a way in which we can get our books back in order in Wellington. No, well, I come back to that fundamental point that, rates caps, that's one issue, and regional councils another. But there's nothing like sitting down, working, going back to basics, because local government has been struggling for some time. So all the various micro policies don't mean all that much to me, but getting everything lined up and having that fundamental reform, I think, is very important. I mean, local government as a portfolio for so many years was an also-ran portfolio, but it's actually a tier one issue at the present time. And so it's got to be dealt with comprehensively and carefully, and not done quickly on the run for press statements. And the whole task of reforming local government is, what would it be, Phil? A 3-year undertaking? Yeah, first year doing your thinking, publishing the papers so that everyone has a good chance to talk about it, and then getting legislation in. It's a very complex area, but hugely important for this country. And central government just can't slam local government because it is struggling and needs a lot of support.
The other thing that I've been looking at, in particular with both these policies, actually, is the National Party is often in New Zealand seen as the party of devolution as well, and giving more power to the regions. And neither of these two policies necessarily seem like it is going to result in more sort of local and community decision making. What do you guys do you think there's a need for that, or do you think that needs to be built into these policies in some way?
Well, I remember Chris Luxon telling me, I agreed with Chris Luxon that Three Waters wasn't the right way to go. We had some good discussions on that. And he said, we've got to get back to localism. Well, this isn't localism. This is absolutely the opposite. And I just think, having promised localism, they're delivering the opposite, and they're doing it. Look, I can understand their need. Sometimes local government gets it wrong. Sometimes they need to be pulled into line. But by and large, the idea of reform ought to be done working in consultation with the people and the local government elected representatives. If you don't do it that way, you'll stuff it up, and you'll end up delivering less, and it'll be costing you more. And that's what I really worry about. That I think it needs to be done a whole lot better than that. And I think take the politics out of it. Now, mea culpa is a long-term central government politician. It's so easy as a central government politician to be all care and no responsibility about local authority matters. Your constituents come to you and say the bloody council's doing this, and you make representations and you thump on the table to the mayor, and it's all good. But the truth of the matter is, we've given local government a serious job to do. And if the government really thinks that they're wasting their money with local government, stop the pretense, stop the bullshitting, abolish it, and run local councils directly from central government, because that's effectively what they're doing. When we set out our annual budget or our 10-year budget, unlike the central government where you have a budget night and you legislate through urgency through the night and it's all in place the next day, local government, we put out our proposals, they go out to the electorate, there's 2 months of consultation, we listen to the submissions, we do a lot of further background research on it. I mean, it is done in full consultation to the people in your area. So it's misleading to suggest that local government is getting it wrong all the time and that central government knows best. Central government is further away from the problem, further away from the information. We take the responsibility and the accountability of rating. I wanted as mayor to clean up our foreshores because the sewage was pouring out of the system on it. We invested in a central interceptor that comes into effect next year that'll cut 80% of sewage overflows in the key areas of the city. We couldn't have done that with a rates cap. We couldn't have done it because it cost money. But I went out to the public and said, I want a targeted rate on water quality. Do you support this? The majority of people said yes. I went ahead and we're doing it 20 years ahead of when the council was previously going to do it. If central government's going to come in and say, no, you can't do that, well, you do the bloody job. Don't pretend that we're here as locally elected representatives representing our community if you override us at every point. Either you believe in democracy or you don't.
Yeah, and I think that point on democracy is important because, politics happens where it touches people's lives, right? Otherwise, it's an abstract thought. And actually, local government touches people's lives a lot more often than central government does on a day-to-day basis, whether it be the water out of the taps or whether it be the bin collection at the end of your street on a Friday.
Yeah, but I do think there's a very good case to be made that one of the problems with local government is that city councillors, especially, and I'm talking about Wellington, full-time, and they don't need to be. And my old buddy, Sir John Jeffreys, Bill's brother, he told me when he was Deputy Mayor of Wellington, he was the Labour guy, Dennis McGrath was the Citizens Fellow. They both were partners in large law firms. They'd go down to the council together at 5 o'clock and do all the governance stuff, sorted things out. With Frank Kitts, they used to wind him up and you just walk around Lambton Quay smiling. I don't think he did too much work. But those two councillors were the ones who made things happen in Wellington, and they were on a per diem. The minute you get city councillors in Wellington who have a full-time job as a city councillor, you get micromanagement and serial stuff-ups.
That could certainly be an interesting way of looking at it. Phil, I might give you the chance to respond to that because I think we might have some agreeable disagreement, as one of our fellow podcasts says.
Well, look, it's like anything. Chris, you and I know MPs that work their guts out, whether they're ministers or they're backbenchers. They're totally dedicated to what they're doing. We also know the ones that are skivers, that pocket the money and don't do much in return. And councillors are no different from that. But I know this, I've never worked harder than I worked as Mayor of Auckland. Even as a cabinet minister. Well, actually, probably I did as leader of the opposition. But, I would put in an 80-hour week, and I never complained about the salary. It was a good salary, and that wasn't the critical thing. But it's certainly not a part-time job when you've got a city the size of Auckland. In the old days in the Mount Roskill Borough Council, in my electorate, which had 60,000 people to look after, it was a part-time job. And, it was a lovely little club, and good people, but, not big responsibilities. And in those days, before Bassett reformed it, we had 860 local authorities in New Zealand, and he cut it to 89. 860 down to 89. But if you're going to create a super city, don't then hobble it so it can't do anything, because otherwise, why did you create the super city?
Well, what I can tell as Minister Simon Watts is that I spoke briefly to Tangi Utakiri on the weekend, who is the Labour spokesperson for local government, and he's more than happy to have a conversation if they want to make this a bipartisan conversation, much in the way that we have today on cross-party lines. So the offer is there. Right, let's move on to the next topic. Phil, you were keeping a very keen eye on the budget in the UK last week, where Chancellor Rachel Reeves was trying her best to keep three masters happy: the public, the markets, and her backbenchers, which can be a bit of a juggle. For context, for those listening, if you don't follow UK politics as closely as Phil or I, Labour promised during the election campaign that there would be no new taxes. But they've had to renege on that and have gone for a bit of a lolly scramble of taxes across the economy to draw in more revenue. Phil, how do you see this being received in the UK? Have you kept an eye on it over the last few days?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's a Meatloaf said that a song that says 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I think she got the backbenchers, and they were on the point of revolt. And she got the backbenchers by scrapping the cap on two-child benefits, which said that if you only got payments if you're a single parent for the first 2 children, and after that you didn't, on the theory that otherwise you'll go out and have 20 children just to take the benefits. Well, the reality is different from that, as Chris and I and you know. And that was actually, it was something that a lot of people had been calling for, and it effectively lifts 450,000 kids out of poverty. So the backbenchers like that. They like the fact that the winter fuel payments, which Labor had scrapped and pissed off 10 million pensioners who lost 300 quid each, that's been reinstated. The disability benefit cuts have been reinstated. So they made it a kind of a Labor budget where they did some things that the Labor backbenchers would like. So backbenchers, relatively happy. The markets, they were happy because she did increase the taxes, mostly by the stealth method of freezing the thresholds so that, as your wages go up, they go up in nominal terms, but not in real terms because it's inflation. But that pushes you up into a new tax bracket. And now you will go up at the new tax bracket because they won't be adjusting the thresholds. But the markets are happy because she's got a hedging fund of $22 billion, which means that she's not doing what Liz Truss did, which was cutting taxes and borrowing more, and got kicked out in 44 days, as we remember. So the markets were reasonably happy. The people that won't be happy will be the people that will be facing higher taxes. And Labor did say very clearly it wouldn't raise taxes. It was an unrealistic promise, given the absolute shite that the British economy is in.
You never make promises like no more taxes. Do you remember G.H.W. Bush in 1988? Read my lips, no new taxes. And actually he raised taxes and knocked the American economy into shape, but it didn't help him with Clinton in 1992. So it's stupid to go to the electorate and make those sorts of comments. Mrs. Thatcher, as I said on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, raised taxes in her first term to get things into shape. But so I hear everything you're saying. The tragedy for Britain, of course, is Brexit. And it was always suggested it would write 4%, I think it was, off the national GDP. And it's trending that way now. It was a cataclysmic decision. It was a total failure of the political class. And most of Britain's problems come from that. But it's worse than the economy, because in my epic trip home from Sydney last night, because the flight turned into something of a marathon, I managed to get a good chunk read of this book by Jonathan Sumption, who's a Supreme Court judge, The Challenges of Democracy and the Rule of Law. And he's got a chapter in here, What's Going On in the United Kingdom. And he talked about Boris Johnson, whom he called an adventurer. 100 years from now, people will say he did to the Conservative Party what Lloyd George did to the Liberal Party in the 1920s. He is just a complete wrecker and a charlatan. We have the rise of populist politics, the fact that the two big beasts of politics, the Tories and the Labour Party, have been shedding members for years. Those who are left are the extremists. They've driven out, the Labour Party, of course, has recovered to a certain extent, but the Tories have driven out if you like, the liberal conservatives. And so what they're facing is something more existential than an economic problem. And I think she had to raise taxes for the sake of the economy. But it's as a result of the failure of the political class over the last decade, as Jonathan Sumption would say, there are far more fundamental problems. And it's incredible to even articulate the question, but he asks the question whether or not Britain can survive as a democracy. Now, we would have said 20 years ago, what a stupid question, but it's seriously raised and argued in this article. Ultimately, he's vaguely positive about Britain, but the fact you're asking questions about one of the oldest democracies in the world, will they slip into authoritarianism or a more authoritarian style of government, which would certainly be the case if that hideous Farage wins the next general election. What you're looking at is more than economic, it's interconstitutional. Now, that may sound somewhat catastrophic and so on, but as he says in the article, a small shift of the vote in 2017 in France would have eliminated the current president, and the final vote would have been between the fascist or the communist. So we can't take any of this stuff for granted anymore, because sooner or later, what was regarded as sort of a fringe constitutional question becomes a central one. So in answer to your question, I'm very pessimistic about Britain. I think they're probably stuffed for 50 years as a result of the Brexit decision. I think you're looking probably at quite possibly the death of the Conservative Party, because a year on they're showing no sign of recovering. You're looking at a Labour Party, which, as Phil said, is 20% in the polls. So people are starting to shop around, and if they choose, and the Greens are creeping up, the Liberal Democrats are creeping up. But if Farage proves the point that populist politics lead to ashes, and so the long and the short of it is Britain's in a shambles.
And I will look back, hopefully democracy doesn't die in Britain anytime soon, but I will look back and have a sliding doors moment where I was working in the UK and I was in the earlock of the radio station I worked for, and Boris Johnson had just walked in, and there was some strikes going on. I think it was the RMT union, and there was also some stuff going on with minimum wage at that particular time. And his aides looked at each other and said, "What's minimum wage? We need to let Boris know what minimum wage is." And having just got the job and having just been working a retail job, I told them the exact minimum wage, which I think at the time was £6.25 or £6.35, something like that. And to this day, I really wish I had have said something like £9 and really got him in trouble. Maybe that would have been the end of Boris Johnson's political career for being so
Yeah,
being
Boris
so
Johnson
out of
and my
touch with
part in
minimum
his
wage.
disaster. Yeah. But there was an interesting poll when I was over last year in the UK, and it showed that one young male, I think it was, in 5 believed it was better to have a strong dictator than a democracy.
You are.
20% of
That's
the
right.
population. And, you know, for a long time, you've had that two-party system, Conservatives and Labor. But there's people aren't going back to the Conservatives because they do blame them. Mind you, if they were looking at Brexit and understood that Brexit was the problem, Nigel Farage played a bigger role than almost anybody else in putting pressure on to pull the United Kingdom out of Europe. But people have forgotten that. I mean, Farage will be in real trouble if he gets elected because he won't be able to deliver. But people have lost faith in the two major parties in delivering in the United Kingdom. And the vote for Farage, the 30%, it's sometimes up to 34%, is not so much an embracing of Farage or his party, but a protest against what they see as the inadequacy of the two large parties.
Mm. I think, yeah, and the only we've talked a lot about Brexit in regards to the English economy and the UK economy, and the sad matter of fact is that the only party that's talking about a closer union with the European Union again is the Liberal Democrats, and they're a long way away from holding any sort of power. So potentially that is something that the Labour Party is going to have to grapple with in the very near future. But from one Labour Party to another, from the UK to New Zealand, anyone listening to this show and interested in politics would have probably been living under a rock to avoid the Labour Party conference over the weekends in the news and on your social media feeds. Chris, you were in Sydney, but as an impartial observer, what have you made of the coverage since you got back? How do you think it landed with the public?
Well, I must say, my weekend was consumed with Beethoven's Ninth, Jonathan's Sumption, and the resignation from the National Party in Australia of that very odd, peculiar fellow Barnaby Joyce.
That New Zealander Barnaby Joyce.
Yeah, that New Zealander Barnaby Joyce.
Shh. You're meant to keep that secret.
Yeah, he decided he wouldn't go with the burqa-clad Pauline Hanson, but he's now the independent member for New England. So I have to confess, and I do apologize to both of you, but I didn't pay too much attention. But I will say this, in the old days, I used to enjoy going to National Party levees because the great thing about it is that the ordinary rank and file would have their opportunity to speak and stand up and challenge ministers and move remits. Some of the remits were borderline insane. There was one guy in the Karori branch of the National Party used to raise a remit every year, which about widening the width of the railway gauge, and it would be voted down. And actually, it was probably not a bad idea, but you'd have to redo all the tunnels and whatever.
But 100 years too late.
Yeah, 100 years too late. But these days, I think conferences involve ministers standing up and talking to the rank and file, rather than, I always think ministers should shut up at party conferences and listen to the rank and file. But I think there's a bit of an attitude, again, I'm sorry to bore you, but coming back to my great book on Jonathan Sumption, and he was saying in the old days, before the radicalisation of the National Parties at constituency level, the constituency associations contributed funding and hard work, but political direction came from the leadership of the parliamentary party. Arthur Balfour, he was an incredible snob, who was the Conservative Prime Minister from 1902 to 1905, is said to have declared he would rather take political advice from his valet and from rank and file members of his party. And so I think that kind of attitude's crept into politics today, that it is your privilege to pay $500, go along to the National Party conference, sit there and be spoken at by members of Parliament, and then they may condescend to speak to you briefly, and then you go home. And so I don't know whether the Labour Party's like that, or whether there was a bit of an opportunity for a bit of argy-bargy. But these things are so seriously choreographed and stage managed now that if someone has a question, they're slapped down, or if someone wants to dissent, they're not allowed to because it may appear bad on the news. Whereas I come from the old school, which was dissent was good, and that you let the rank and file have their say, because after all, they're the people who do all the work for the party, organised in the old days, the cake stalls and the canvassing. And you get the impression these days that many MPs use the party as their vehicle for advancement, but they don't love the party, they don't believe in the party, and that's what happens. And
What I can tell you, Chris, is that the New Zealand Labour Party still has a robust system for the policy debate and platform debate. And during the conferences, there's certainly some rancor and some argy-bargy, all in the goal of course, getting to the best possible place for the policy. Phil, how did you think the weekend's events landed?
Look, I thought it was very upbeat, and I think it was you could tell from Chris Hipkins that he had the wind behind him, and there's a great speech by Barbara Edmonds as well, similar to the same messages that Chris was giving. She summed it up beautifully. I might just relay a couple of those messages a little later. But look, Chris is right. Party conferences have changed from the early days when I went there, hitchhiked down to Wellington. We had 5-day conferences. They were dominated by remit debates. I was president of Young Labour and stood up and gave these firebrand speeches saying half of our MPs should resign. They've been there too long. It's time to make way for better people. I mean, why? At 18, I knew everything. So it is a showcase. Yeah, but no. Look, I thought the conference was buoyed by the fact that they thought that there was a chance for an historic win after one term of a national-led coalition. That's never happened in history. It's still, I think on television, I might have upset people by saying I thought it was evenly balanced, and I think it is evenly balanced, actually. But I think Labor knows that it has a chance. Usually at the end of your first term, you're still taking a hammering for all your sins in the past, and the government is, reliant on the fact that, good old Kiwi with it, let's give them a fair go, give them a second term and see what they can really do. I think the Labor activists know that Christopher Luxon isn't John Key, that he's not performing in the way that he can carry the country with him. And so it was upbeat, but it was that Edmonds speech where she combined three things: hope, aspiration, and realism. And those are the three things that Starmer failed to do before the election in the United Kingdom and after. He didn't provide enough hope and uplifting and looking at the horizon. This is what we want to achieve for our country. And nor did he provide that realism that this is going to be hard. And you and I have got to work together to get through this. We can't do it overnight. This will take years, but this is what we're trying to achieve. We've got a plan to do it. We are going to get there. We are going to make a better future. Stick with me, work with me. We'll do it together. And, that's why I say if you, in politics, and you know that you've got to make hard decisions in government, don't pretend that you don't before the election and then say afterwards, oh my God, things are so much worse than we thought, because people are cynical about that. Come out with a plan, be realistic, give people hope, and show that you can do it. And, I thought that Hipkins' speech and Edmonds' speech came into that category where they set it out reasonably clearly and they went across reasonably well. And the delegates went away enthused. And the public on television, watching it on television, I think would have looked at a party that said, these people, they're owning up to some of their mistakes. They're keen, they're enthusiastic, they want to do the right thing, and maybe we can give them a chance.
And we're always really careful to make sure we're not sounding like a party political broadcast. But the main policy that was announced yesterday was the local doctors' loan scheme. Chris, have you had a chance to get across that this morning?
Regret to say I haven't. I was too busy reading Jonathan Sumption. But look, this is not a party political broadcast because, after all, I'm centre right. But it's interesting to get those insights into the sort of the call to arms for next year, and you've got to enthuse the team. You can't treat them the way Arthur Balfour treated the rank and file members of the Conservative Party. So if that was what was aimed to be done over the weekend and they achieved it, well, they entered 2026 in a reasonably good state, so we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, I don't think that policy statement was an election winner. It was just a little piece of the jigsaw that said, if we're going to get more people to see GPs on the basis that if they get help, prevention is better than cure, it's more humane and it's cheaper, then you've got to make sure they have access to a GP. And I think it touched on this old nostalgic thing about your family GP. My doctor was a doctor in a 2-person partnership in Papakura. Now they've got a big, it's not corporate, but they've got 5 and it's a big edifice and it's lost some of that personal feeling. But people are nostalgic about going back to their GP and their local GP, working hard, being part of the community. And the GPs Association did come out and say, this is a good step in the right direction. This will help allow more people to set up and practice and take away a barrier. So I think it achieved its purpose. But is it a policy that's going to swing 100,000 votes? No, it won't. One other point I could make is that I thought it was interesting that they put on the platform Kushla Tangiri Manuel, the one Labour MP representing a Māori seat. And I thought she was very good. And, this is not a Labour Party that says, well, we're just going to have this natural alliance with Te Pāti Māori. It's a Labour Party that says we can win those seats back and we're going for those seats. We can show Māori people that they've long been part of our movement and we can deliver for them in a way that these guys that are tearing themselves apart with disunity and personality conflicts can't do and can't represent you. And I think, there was Ngarimu Blair was there from Ngāti Whātua, and he made quite a succinct comment by saying, well, yeah, if you can't win the Māori seats back, I'll be very surprised, given the confusion and the disunity that exists in Te Pāti Māori. So there was a distinct plug for those seats to come back to Labour as well. But of course, at the moment, Labour does well because there's an overhang of two seats, because the Māori Party gets more seats than it gets as a share of its proportion of the votes. And I think on the right of centre side, they'll be saying, well, if the Māori Party disappears, that might be a good thing because it takes away that overhang and a two-seat advantage that the left of centre might otherwise have.
Yeah, and I think two points to make on that. Ngarimu Blair and Ngāti Whātua were at pains to say over the weekend that they will also continue moving forward and work with either party. Essentially, what they've said is they are holding the reins for their own hapu and they are moving forward, and it's up to both National and Labour to catch up to them. And I think the other point on the Māori Party or Te Pāti Māori versus Labour in the Māori seats, Takuta Ferris came out over the weekend and mentioned that maybe the independents could be looking to work with the Labour Party to ensure there is that overhang, which I thought was quite rich from someone that came out earlier this year to say that New Zealand Labour Party volunteers shouldn't be campaigning in Māori seats at all. Chris, do you think maybe that shows a bit of political naivety from his perspective?
Oh, I don't know. I think the reality of the matter is that all the Māori seats went to New Zealand first in 1996. They all came back in 99. In 2008, a whole swag of them went over to the Māori Party, and then slowly but surely Labour won them back. So I think it's yin and yang, and I can't see on current performance that the Māori Party will be around at the next election. Oh, you might get Titai Hararu and Waiariki remaining with them, but the others, I think, will come back. It's just Labour had a hammerlock on them for years and years, didn't it? And even someone as distinguished as James Henare stood in Eastern Māori and lost to who was it? Brown Rawati or?
Yeah, that was that Ngāta? Henare stood in
he was Northern. I'm thinking of Ngāta. Ngāta Jr.
Yeah, Saraparana Ngāta. Yeah,
of course, he lost his seat in 43. So you've had some very distinguished National Party candidates, and they just couldn't break through.
Yeah,
and Peter Tapsell, someone I knew, a guy from Te Hutu Hapu of Te Whanaapa-Nui, and Peter Tapsell visited him and said, look, Joe, and I really need someone to be chair of the local Labour Party. And he said, well, no point coming to me, I'm national. He said, oh, that doesn't matter. So he became...
That doesn't sound like a conversation we'd have.
So he became the chair of the Whanaapa-Nui branch of the Labour Party, even though he was a Nat. But look, I can't help thinking that the hammerlock went in 96, but the trend seems to be you vote for, or the Māori seats go away for a while just to let Labour know who's in charge. Then slowly but surely they come back. And I don't see any reason to moved from my prediction that the Māori Party would probably be down to 2 seats, probably maybe even less, after the 26th election.
Phil, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think it's I'm kind of reluctant to be predictive. If the by-election had happened a month later, the result would have been the other way around in the by-election. I think that when, and it looks like that, as I said a couple of episodes back, the Māori Party is pretty much divided down the middle. Actually, there's the leadership hanging in with Tamahiri. There's the Member of Parliament for Waikato Tainui, who's saying both sides are stupid and they need to get their act together. The new candidate,
Moreni
Kaipara,
Kaipara.
for Tamaki Makaurau, who is leaning towards going with the Titai Tokoro and Takuta Ferris. It's hard to see how that can come together. And knowing Tamahiri, he won't be inclined to show any compromise or to try to weld the organisation together. So it's hard to see how they'll dig themselves out of that hole. But I mean, I think the important thing about Labor at the conference was that they weren't complacent. They didn't think it was going to be handed to them. They knew they had to go out there, work for regaining the respect and the support of the electorate, and a determination to do that.
Towards the end of the year, we will actually be recording an episode where we will be looking at 2026 and trying to make a few predictions, which will probably come out early in 2026 itself. So stay tuned for that. The other thing that we're going to do before Christmas, for those listening, is we're going to do a special Q&A episode so that you guys can get your questions in for Chris and Phil. They have actually been coming in thick and fast without me even asking on the social channels. People have been direct messaging questions. So I'm gathering those, but I'll also let the listeners know how they can submit more in the coming couple of weeks. Don't forget to follow us on at Cross Party Lines on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We'd love to have you there. Follow the podcast wherever you're listening, and make sure you tell some friends about us, because that's how we grow, and we grow the movement. Okay, guys, we traversed all sorts of topics today, some that we planned, some that we didn't, but thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next week, eh?
Yeah, mate wa.